Hello, everyone. Hope you are well. Welcome to episode 91 of Sword of the Spirit, Sermonator. Last week, we began a study in Deuteronomy chapter 13, and it took us all the way to Revelation. Once again, the consistency and the unity of the Word. We learned some things last week that should create in our minds as we read them, particularly when God says we're to love Him with all our heart and soul. And curiously enough, many chapters after the introduction of the Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4, which was the Lord's ancient prayer He gave to the children of Israel, He knew and clearly saw, obviously, what man really needed to do to be and live the way God asked. We notice that in Deuteronomy 13, He says we're to love Him with all our heart and soul. But curious by its absence is might, right? Might. And that, as we know from our studies and multiple times that we've covered this, our might, our strength is in the Spirit. A spirit that not only was not in the world at that time, but wouldn't be for thousands of years later till the Messiah, all right? Which brought us closer. Now, God can transfigure people. God can do whatever He wants. But for man, we're told that God is one and we are three. But that third part was not present in the world in the time of Moses, in the time of the older books of the Tanakh. It was not present. What was present was God's order and God's commandments. And we need to be able to understand that all those years, the absence of God's Spirit in man, not in the world, because He did things, It's funny how we differentiate between what God said and what God does. It's to us to recognize that the first thing and the first order of creation, even in Genesis, is what God did, and not what He said. He didn't have to say anything. All He had to do was breathe on it. Nephesh, His spirit, covered the nothingness and made something. Ex nihilo, creation from nothing, which is what creation is. Notice human beings don't create. We don't create anything. We recreate or we procreate. We copy. All right? Even ourselves. Procreation is a copy of ourselves. A copy, a product of the union of a man and a woman. Yet, no one but God can ultimately lay claim on the product of that reproductive process. Why? Every human being that's ever been born and ever will be born has its own separate, distinct, and unique DNA. It's not the father's, nor it is the mother's, nor is it the mother's. It is unique, thus establishing us as yet a new procreated individual. That's what we do. We recreate. We cannot create from nothing. There's always something. The difference being what God did and what He said. And what He said was the establishment of how to live for His people, called by His name. How to live. These are the things that the laws, the commandments, the statutes, the precepts that run throughout not only the Older Testament, covenant, and the books, but throughout the New. Nothing's changed. We've often spoken about in the New Testament how it says that Jesus is the end of the law. We've broken that down at least a dozen times. In English, it says that. In Aramaic, its original language it was written in, says nothing of the sort. Jesus Christ is the end of the law. The anointed salvation of God is the telos, or the goal of the instruction in the Torah. To point us toward what? Toward the Messiah. And ultimately what? Toward the power, the might, the Spirit. So, even as we did our study in Deuteronomy 13 last week, now we're going to go back to Deuteronomy 11 and 12. And we're going to take our time to go through to understand that this is not simply a history book. It is a method and a process book with examples of God's action, not just His word. The word becomes action, becomes enacted and appointed when it is spoken forth by God here or to us in spirit, which reiterates, strengthens, amplifies, and bolsters not only the content, but the intent of Scripture. I want to read a passage to you. And it's in Deuteronomy 12. It's verse 28. And we're going to go back and forth. So remember, the rhyme and the reason that were put to chapters and verse here in the Word were for man's benefit. We did that, all right? But the language, the Word, the Spirit that infuses the Word, all is one. Deuteronomy 12, verse 28 says, "Observe and hear all these words which I command thee, that it may go well with thee and with thy children after thee forever, when thou doest good and right in the sight of the Lord thy God." Now there's a couple other words in there. When thou doest that which is, doesn't need to be said. Those italics words are added. So what it says, it'll go well with you and your children, with thee forever, when thou doest right in the sight of the Lord thy God. So that's the preface, that's the preamble for our message today. But it sits right in between the total message. Remember, there are 10 words or commandments, and we know that they are the universal application of what is right in God's eyes for all mankind. But there are 619 laws in Scripture, all right, that were given to the Israelites, or the Hebrews. And that's a lot of laws. What are they? Are they generative or are they derivative? They're derivative and they're generative, by the way. They're derived from each of the 10 words that were given universally. The words, many of the other commandments were given for the nation of Israel, the Hebrew people, as they wandered, sojourned, were captured and conquered by many peoples. God's word didn't change, and whether you're in bondage or not, and most of the times when they wound up in captivity or bondage, it's because they failed miserably to keep what God asked. Now you say 619 laws, that's a lot. Not really, it's not. I can tell you that our societies today have many, 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 many more, and many perversions or of those laws, twisting and turning. That's why if you study the law, I remember being in law school many years ago, and we did a case study method, which is essentially a book of cases that were heard, real cases that were heard in courts by judges around the world, around the nation rather. And it was very interesting because the professors would say, read this case, study it, and prepare a brief, which is, a legal brief. And in doing so, I can remember sitting there. It was in Los Angeles, and reading in dark and night, trying to grasp and understand the mechanisms and the cases and how they were determined and why they were determined based on this evidence, that evidence, whatever the case may be, no pun intended. The most curious thing was when I had studied and learned, and I saw the judge's determination on the alleged facts or the intricate items within the case study itself. We felt pretty comfortable in that, okay, this decision was rendered, and yeah, that's how it got there, and we thought we knew something. I thought I learned something until I looked at the end of those chapters, which said dissenting opinions. And that, above all things, was the most unique. You see, because it's always been my contention when you go to law school or you study the law, and you can study the law, you can study the Hebrew law, the biblical law. At Rutgers Camden has an entire curriculum based on Torah law, okay? You find that not every judge sees things the same way. There were anywhere from 5 to 10 differing opinions for different reasons in each case. So it became very clear to me that I was not there in law school to learn the law. I was there to learn how to become a lawyer. And there's a big difference, okay? Because these dissenting cases, watch an episode of Law and Order someday and see how the prosecutor and the defending attorneys argue from different points of view and point to specific case law to influence the judge or not the Supreme Court, but well, it really doesn't matter, the indictments, and they talk about different legal opinions on the same subject, which means that the law, which we believe is supposed to be sacrosanct, has many different viewpoints based upon the input and the knowledge and understanding of the judge. So 619 laws, biblical laws, are not very many, and when you look at them, there are overwhelming amount that I would challenge anybody to say which ones are not for today. Simple things like keeping clean, don't putting yourself in harm's way or people in harm's way with disease and germs. Remember, these were wanderers in the desert. Things of the nature that tell us don't defile us with certain things, and we know that they can. There's a lot of laws about cleaning and staying away from the family. Do not touch a dead body. Well, in the Middle Ages, when there was a great bubonic plague, there was a doctor. His name was Semmelweis, and he washed his hands as he dealt with the dead bodies, the cadavers. These were doctors, crude as they may have been back then. And what happened, believe it or not, was that the Jewish people back then were blamed for causing the bubonic plague. Why? Because they weren't dying during the plague time. The dead bodies were everywhere. There were millions and millions of people laying and dying in the streets and breeding more disease upon more disease. And people were touching those bodies and getting sick and dying, and they didn't understand why. But they looked at the Jews and they said, they're not dying. They must be the ones that caused this. Okay? And Dr. Semmelweis gave us the way forward. He followed the biblical precept. He washed his hands. It was that easy. He washed his hands. Didn't get sick. So it's things like that. There's another one. A dear friend of mine, an Orthodox gentleman up in a town in northern Ocean County, Jewish community. And there's a law in the Bible that also says, give a just weight or a just measure. Or I would go into his shop and I would say, "Yes, give me some pickles." And he would put, "Do you want the juice?" And I say, of course, of course. And he would fill up a container with the pickles and with the brine. But curiously enough, before he weighed them to give me a price, he set the brine aside in a different container, such that the weight that I was being given was an honest weight of the product that I wanted, the pickles. Okay? That is a man of integrity. That is the kind of law that he's talking about. You know, the old joke about how the butcher puts his thumb on the scale and charge a little bit more for your product. And you see little things like that, and you recognize the honesty and the goodness of things like that. And the laws, the 619 laws are filled with things like that, replete. Why? For the benefit of good, honest living, kindness, cleanness. There are some pretty tough laws in there too. People like to point to stoning people. Well, it's not recorded anywhere that I could find that anybody got stoned for some of the one or two things in the Torah within those laws. And we come to an understanding that the only laws that have gone away were the laws of blood sacrifice, where someone, a testator in a testament, someone has to die. And in the Old Testament, that covenant was a covenant of blood, and many animals were slaughtered, sacrificed, hundreds of thousands on each feast day. And yet, the spirit of power and might was not there, because we lived under not the specter, but the umbrella of physical laws that would keep us as men and women and children, human beings, in at least a right standing with God until that bloodline was continued and evolved through all the horrors and the attempted ending and genocides that we see that these people went through for thousands of years until the Messiah was born. And what happened? John, his cousin, saw the Spirit descend right upon him in the waters of the Jordan River. No longer the need for the blood of bull and goats, as it says in Hebrews, because that blood atonement had been satisfied once and for all by one man made of God, filled with his word, and the first and only human being to be filled with God's actual Spirit. And that is why we see in 13 that God did not say the might. He said body and soul, but in Deuteronomy 6:4, he tells us ahead of time what our composition is and how we're to worship God. So that being said, we have a preamble, set the pace. You've heard all these things before, and they will continue to come out, because it's not something that we can just hear once, maybe twice. We have to put it in here. Like God said, no longer written on tablets of stone, but written upon hearts of flesh. And until we hear it, begin to live it, understand it, grasp it, and embrace it and say, oh my goodness, this is what it's about. And when that Spirit finally enters and hits, everything becomes so much more clear. But anyway, let's take a look here in Deuteronomy, the 10th chapter. In verses 12 through 22, 10 verses, we are told, first and foremost, to love God. Listen and follow with me. Deuteronomy 10, verse 12. And now, Israel, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee, but to fear the Lord thy God? That is, to have reverence and to not fear like quake and shudder, but to have a healthy, dignified respect and awe. To walk in all his ways and to love him and to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul. You say, gee, that's awfully high-minded, isn't it? Well, not really. Not really. We serve different masters every day of our lives. We work for our boss. We serve our family or our spouses. All of those things are serving in one way, shape, or another. That's what we do daily, right? We listen to the words of politicians or leaders, judges even, and God, above all, who made us and created all things. Why do we find it so difficult often to love, serve, and obey him? And again, he says, and to serve the Lord thy God, listen now, with all thy heart and with all thy soul. Once again, the commandments are in the physical to get us to the place of the Messiah. All those who died before him will see life again. Everyone has the right, our inheritance, to be able to be saved. But that's what he says to do. He says, keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command thee this day, for thy good, for our benefit. Behold, the heaven and the heaven of heavens is the Lord's thy God, the earth also, with all that therein is. Only the Lord had a delight in thy fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them, even you, above all people, as it is this day. Circumcise, therefore, the foreskin of your heart, and be no more stiff-necked. We've spoken of that. A stiff-necked people. Well, I'm going to do what I want to do, my way, this way, that way. Well, you can do that. That is our choice. We're given a free will choice. But the free will choice isn't capricious in that we could do this one day and that the next day and decide, oh yeah, I'm going to do God's way. You can't have it both ways. You're either going to go our way or we're going to go God's way, period. And that's what he's saying. Circumcise the foreskin of your heart, not just your flesh. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, a great God, a mighty and a terrible, which regards not persons, nor takes reward. He can't be bribed. He can't be coaxed. It was like Simon Magus went to the apostles and said, hey, I'm seeing you guys doing these miracles and everything. How much do I got to pay you to get this? They looked at him like, this is not magic, and magus means magician or magi, astrologers. He says it's not for you. God does not regard or respect a person or persons that are trying to merchandise or emulate. This is something of the heart. He says your heart's got to be circumcised. And that means he's not going to favor one over the other. He loves us all. He just said that. He loves you, I love your children, and all forever. He executes the judgment of the fatherless and the widow and loves the stranger in giving him food and raiment. Listen to this. Love ye therefore the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And thou shalt fear the Lord thy God, and him shalt thou serve, and to him shalt thou cleave or hold on to, like a child holds on to the leg of their father. You ever see a daddy when a baby holds their lower leg and stands on their foot, and daddy walks with the baby? Cleave, hold on to me, and swear by his name. In other words, be faithful to his name. He is thy praise, and he is thy God, that hath done for thee these great and terrible means mighty, things, unbelievable things, like parting the water of the sea, which thine eyes have seen. Okay, He's saying it. This is a testament. This is not a proclamation. He says, which your eyes saw physically. Thy fathers went down into Egypt with 70 persons, 70 people. And now the Lord thy God hath made thee as the stars of heaven for the multitude. 70 people. Wasn't it only a week or so when we talked about the 70 disciples that the Lord sent out? Okay? He sent out, and they went and they preached and they taught. And what does the number 70 mean? It's a number of universality, okay? As we speak of this word, it's universal. And it has a word of Israel and restoration, okay? The number 7 is the number of completeness and spiritual perfection. All right, the number 10 is the testimony, the law, and the responsibility. Those are the 3 things that we're accountable for. The testimony, remember in Revelation it says that he who has the law and the testimony of prophecy, that is the combination that we seek. That's what God said. That's what this says right here. And this is Deuteronomy, all right? Deuteronomy, the 5th and last book of the Pentateuch. And here we have it. That is the beginning of wisdom here. Okay? And why does he say this? If we look through chapter 11, we can see very clearly that there are the study and obey the commandments that he's given us. All right? And there are reasons. I'm not going to point and pick out every one, but I'm going to tell you just a few. In chapter 11, verse 7, listen to what it says. But your eyes have seen all the great acts of the Lord, which he did. Again, a reaffirmation that Israel, you saw this. You saw me deliver. You saw the 10 plagues in Egypt. You saw none of those things come to your harm. You saw the deliverance out of Mizraim, which is Egypt's name in Hebrew, which means bondage. All right? You've seen this. Therefore, shall you keep the commandments which I command you this day. Why? Listen, the end of verse 8, chapter 11. That you may be strong and go in and possess the land whither you go to possess it. It's pretty straightforward. In verse 16, take heed to yourselves that your heart be not deceived, and that you don't turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. Otherwise, the Lord's wrath will be kindled upon you. We don't want that. He says, I'll kindle it against you. I'll shut up the heaven, that there'll be no rain, that the land that I've given you of milk and honey will not yield her fruit, and that you will perish quickly off the good land which the Lord gives you. Why? Simple. There is none beside God. That's the first commandment. I'm the Lord your God. There be no false gods before me. Now listen, verse 18 of chapter 11. Therefore shall you lay up these my words in your heart and in your soul. All right? Again, heart and soul. Body, soul, mind, intellect, psyche, emotions. And bind them for a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. Why? So, as in verse 21, that your days may be multiplied in the days of your children in the land which the Lord swore unto your fathers to give them, as the days of heaven upon the earth. And then will the Lord drive out all the nations from before you, and you shall possess greater nations and mightier than yourselves. What a promise. What are we seeing in the world today? And what have we seen since 1967? All the nations that attacked Israel, 6 at one time. 6 nations, 6 days. Gone. Gone. And so it is even today. They may not live in total peace, but they are secure. Anyway, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back to put the rest of this together. Okay, see you in a minute.